I'm pretty sure I hold the world record for the most absurd and politically motivated case of property destruction in the history of this state, and maybe even the country. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm a structural engineer and a public servant. So, when I tell you what happened on a Tuesday morning at 4 a.m., I want you to know I'm speaking from a place of cold, hard fact. The sound started as a low rumble, a deep, resonating hum that vibrated up through the foundation and into my very bones. It was a sound I knew instinctively wasn't right. A sound that said steel on steel, earth moving. I think I might have set a new record for the fastest a man can go from a deep sleep to pure, adrenaline-fueled panic. You won't believe what happened next. Seriously, I've seen some things in my life, but this was a whole new level of audacity. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I promise you, this story is worth it. The cracking started next. Not the small creaks of an old house settling, but the sharp, violent splintering of drywall and plaster. My wife screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the darkness. The whole house was shuddering now, a rhythmic assault that felt like a deliberate act. I grabbed my kids from their beds, my mind a blank slate of instinct. Get them out. Get them out, now. We stumbled down the collapsing staircase, the air thick with dust and the smell of pulverized rock. Just as we reached the front door, the entire facade of our mansion, the portico and the majestic columns came crashing down. We were out of the house, standing barefoot in the pre-dawn cold, watching our home disintegrate before our eyes. The flashing red and blue lights of a dozen emergency vehicles were already painting stripes across the scene, but they weren't fire trucks or ambulances. They were here for the demolition. I strode out onto my front lawn, still in my pajamas, and confronted a man in a hard hat. "What in the hell is going on?" I yelled. He just shrugged, pointing to a stern-faced woman in a perfectly tailored power suit, who was watching the destruction with a smug, satisfied smirk. "Orders from the HOA, sir," he said. "Unpaid fines." She stepped forward, a smug, satisfied smirk on her face, holding a beige envelope. I stood there in my pajamas, my breath a cloud of steam in the cold morning air, as she handed me the beige envelope. It felt significant, heavy with a kind of bureaucratic malevolence. I snatched it from her hand and ripped it open, my mind still struggling to comprehend the utter insanity unfolding before me. Inside was not some simple notice, but a stack of invoices and a formal, legalistic foreclosure and demolition order. The amount was over 200. Zero. For what? I quickly scanned the pages, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The charges were so absurd they felt like a joke. Excessive rose bushes was at the top. We had 3 antique rose bushes on a property that was 5 acres. Then, non-regulation lawn gnome placement. We didn't even own a lawn gnome. But the one that really got me was unapproved exterior paint shade. My home was on the historical registry. The paint was a precise, documented, period-accurate color. I looked from the invoices to the woman who was watching my house fall down. My house, with my family's memories still trapped inside. "This is a mistake, Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously low. "There is no way we owe this." She simply looked at me with a cold, dismissive glare. "Regulations are regulations, Governor," she replied, her voice an icy monotone. The slight, almost imperceptible emphasis on the word governor dripped with condescension. It was a taunt. I demanded to see the proof of notification, the certified letters they were legally required to send. Her smirk widened. "We sent multiple notices. All ignored. You were given ample opportunity to rectify the issue. My personal assistant, my chief of staff, my wife, we have a meticulous system for documentation. Not a single piece of mail, email, or a phone call had ever been missed." The sudden sinking realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't some clerical error. This was a deliberate, targeted act of malice. This wasn't about fines. It was about power. And they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to get my family to a nearby hotel. My wife was still in shock, holding our kids close, her body trembling. I tried to reassure her, but what do you say after your home has just been systematically destroyed by a bulldozer? We were safe. That was the most important thing. But the feeling of violation was a physical weight in my chest. Back at the rubble of our home, the scene had become a circus. A dozen news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes raised like metallic prayer beads to the heavens. Flashing red and blue lights from police cars painted chaotic stripes across the remains of my life. I stood a little distance away, the cold seeping into my pajamas, my brain finally catching up to the gravity of the situation. This was no mistake. This was a direct, targeted attack. My first call wasn't to the police, it was to my chief of staff. David, get down here. Get a perimeter set up. I need a full legal team on standby. My second call was to my personal attorney, Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had handled every curveball my political career had thrown at her. She arrived an hour later, her face a mask of disbelief as she took in the scene. She immediately recognized the sheer audacity of it. "Mark, this is extreme overreach," she said, her voice tight with professional outrage. "This isn't just a civil suit. This is a criminal matter." The final call was to a wise, grizzled former judge named Thompson, a man who had seen it all. I gave him a curt, factual summary. His response was a dry, incredulous laugh. "Demolished for fines? Mark, even the mob had more paperwork." The chaos of the morning slowly began to solidify into a cold, methodical resolve. I looked at Sarah, at the media frenzy, at the remains of my home. "This isn't just about my house, Sarah," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This is about due process, about justice, and these people are about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you cross the line." My lawyer, Sarah, and I began the deep dive into the abyss that was the HOA's history and, more specifically, Brenda's personal vendettas. It was like peeling back the layers of a carefully constructed facade to reveal the rot underneath. The more we dug, the more we found a pattern of aggression and intimidation that went back years. It wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about wielding power. We found accounts from former residents who were driven out by a barrage of arbitrary fines and petty harassment. They had all dared to question Brenda's authority, and they all paid the price. It was a digital ghost, a paper trail of 1,000 small cuts. As we sifted through the old minutes and email chains, my mind kept drifting back to the small, subtle skirmishes I'd had with Brenda over the years. The way she'd always seemed to gravitate toward me at neighborhood events, not with friendly chatter, but with pointed questions about the state of my hedges or the precise angle of my lawn lighting. She was always testing the boundaries, looking for a weakness. The absurdity of the unapproved exterior paint shade fine finally clicked into place. I remembered the conversation vividly. It was at a summer barbecue. She had approached me, her eyes fixated on my home on the hill, and told me, with that patronizing smirk, that the beige of my house was not within the HOA's approved palette. I, a certified architectural preservationist, had calmly explained that the house was on the historical registry and that state laws on historical preservation superseded any HOA regulation. She had gone quiet, a flicker of cold, dark fury in her eyes, and walked away without another word. The memory of that look now sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some random, overzealous HOA president. This was a personal vendetta. She had been looking for a way to humiliate me, to prove that even the governor wasn't above her petty rules, and she just found the most outrageous way to do it. While Sarah worked the legal angles, I fell back on my old profession. Before I was a governor, I was a structural engineer. I'd built bridges and buildings, and I'd overseen their controlled, meticulous teardowns. I knew what a proper demolition looked like, what it smelled like. What Brenda had done was a hack job. I walked the perimeter of the ruins, a ghost among the rubble, and my professional eye immediately picked up on a litany of glaring violations. There were no safety fences up to code, no proper dust mitigation, and no evidence of a pre-demolition survey for hazardous materials. They hadn't even disconnected the main utilities properly. The crew itself, when I'd confronted them, had seemed green. They weren't the seasoned, grizzled veterans you hire for a job this size. They were subcontractors who likely asked no questions as long as the check cleared. It was clear they'd been hired for their plausible deniability. As I detailed these violations to Sarah, my anger transitioned from a hot, burning fury to a cold, analytical precision. It was now a problem to be solved, a faulty structure to be dismantled piece by piece. We started building our case, not with emotion, but with facts. We took photos and time-stamped every single one. We cross-referenced the state's demolition protocols with the HOA's non-existent permits. I pulled up the intricate, detailed blueprints of my own home. Every beam, every wire, every load-bearing wall. I explained to Sarah, in the detached, factual language of an engineer, what a legitimate demolition entails. 1,000 careful steps, a methodical process to preserve what can be saved and contain the rest. What Brenda did wasn't a process. It was a brutal, ignorant act of destruction. It was a sledgehammer where a scalpel was required. And with every detail I documented, with every violation I pointed out, the legal noose around Brenda's neck tightened just a little bit more. Her arrogance had not only driven her to destroy my home, but it had also led her to cut every corner, leaving a perfect trail for me to follow. As a methodical man, I knew that every action leaves a trace, especially in the digital world. So, my chief of staff, David, didn't just hire a legal team. He brought in a group of forensic IT specialists to comb through my family's digital records, our emails, and every scanned piece of physical mail. They were looking for the notifications Brenda claimed she had sent. We knew they didn't exist, but we needed to prove their non-existence with irrefutable evidence. The results came back as a stark, empty void. Not a single email from the HOA, no digital record of a certified mail receipt, not even a casual flyer tucked into our online portal. It was as if we had never existed to them until the moment they sent the bulldozers. But that wasn't the whole story. While my records were a blank slate, the internal communications of the HOA were a churning sea of data. Our IT team, with the authority of a state investigation, dug into the HOA's servers. What they found was a flurry of communications around the time the fines were supposedly issued. The language was coded, cryptic. Mentions of the hill, the architect, and the problem house were frequent. It was a clear, coordinated effort to fabricate a paper trail. The ghost in the machine was even more damning. The team found a series of burner email accounts and anonymous posts on neighborhood forums, all subtly attacking my property and lifestyle. The way my family lived, the events we hosted, it was all scrutinized and nitpicked. They even found a detailed history of a woman named Brenda who had been obsessively following my public life for years, fixating on my historic preservation work. This wasn't just a random act of a power-hungry HOA president. This was a personal crusade. The digital breadcrumbs led right back to Brenda, confirming my deepest suspicions. She hadn't just been looking for a reason, she had been looking for me. My lawyer, Sarah, began the difficult task of knocking on doors and asking questions. This exclusive community, so pristine and idyllic from the outside, felt like a small, terrified kingdom under Brenda's rule. At first, no one would speak. Doors were opened a crack, eyes darted nervously, and the only answers we got were whispered warnings. "She runs this place with an iron fist." One man hissed through a barely open gap, "You don't cross Brenda." It was a climate of fear so pervasive that even with a governor's resources and the full weight of the state behind us, people were genuinely afraid for their properties, their peace of mind. Brenda had created a culture where every neighbor was an informant and every infraction was a weapon. But the sheer audacity of what happened to my family, the demolition of a public figure's home, was so outrageous it began to fracture that fear. A few brave souls, emboldened by the thought that if it could happen to the governor, it could happen to them, finally started talking. Their stories were chillingly similar to mine. They recounted tales of arbitrary fines for overgrown hedges that weren't overgrown, for fences that were the wrong shade of white, and for dogs that barked too loudly. One elderly couple, their hands shaking, tearfully showed Sarah a meticulously organized binder. Inside were years of receipts and correspondence, proof that they had paid every single fine every single month, only to have their property threatened anyway. The HOA board, they explained, was just a rubber stamp for Brenda. They painted a picture of a tyrannical HOA, operating completely outside the bounds of law, with Brenda at its head, a queen of a beige kingdom built on fear and malice. Their quiet desperation turned to a righteous anger, and it became clear that Brenda hadn't just made an enemy of me, she had made enemies of an entire community. We knew the personal vendetta was a strong motivator for Brenda, but as a public servant, I also knew that almost every act of outright malice is ultimately tied to a financial motive. So, we expanded our investigation. My financial forensics team, a group of quiet, methodical accountants, began to comb through the HOA's financial records. The numbers didn't lie. They found a series of suspicious transactions, a steady stream of exorbitant fees paid out to a shell corporation for vague consulting services and maintenance. The amounts were outrageous, far beyond anything a small HOA would need to spend. The shell corporation's listed address led to a dead end, a P.O. box, at a mail forwarding service in another state. But with some old-fashioned digging and a few phone calls, the team found the real owner, the sole proprietor listed on the incorporation documents, Brenda's brother-in-law. It was an unholy alliance, a petty family scam. The money trail became a clear, undeniable line that led directly from the HOA's coffers to Brenda's family. She had been treating the community association like her personal piggy bank, siphoning off funds for years, leaving the HOA teetering on the brink of financial collapse. This, then, was the real reason behind the unpaid fines and the demolition. It wasn't just a matter of revenge, though that was a powerful part of it. It was a common tactic for financially distressed HOAs. Manufacture a reason to seize a valuable property, then sell it off to stave off bankruptcy. Our home, my family's beautiful historic mansion, was nothing more than a potential asset to be liquidated, a pawn in her personal game of suburban warfare. The conspiracy deepened, far beyond the scope of a personal grudge. Brenda wasn't just a bully with a clipboard. She was a criminal who had used her position of authority to commit a felony. And with that realization, my cold, righteous anger turned into a resolute, unwavering determination to see justice served. My personal attorney, Sarah, is a predator in a courtroom, and she didn't hesitate for a second. With the evidence we had compiled, she immediately went on the offensive. The next day, before the sun had fully risen, she had filed a series of emergency injunctions and restraining orders against the HOA. The legal documents were a work of art, a surgical strike that immediately froze the HOA's operations, halting any further demolition and preventing them from even thinking about touching the land. She outlined a clear list of civil charges: trespass, destruction of private property, negligence, emotional distress, and a healthy dose of fraud. The civil suit was going to be a bloodbath, a righteous reckoning where every penny they had would be seized to pay for the damages. But as satisfying as that was, I knew it wasn't enough. A civil suit was about money. I wanted justice. I wanted to send a message that you can't simply terrorize people and get away with it. I wanted criminal charges. A bully like Brenda had to be dealt with in a way that she couldn't just pay her way out of. I used my contacts in the state attorney general's office, not as a demand from a governor, but as a formal, professional request from a victim of a crime. I presented them with the evidence we had painstakingly gathered: the fabricated fines, the fraudulent financial transactions, the clear and present malice. The AG's office, initially skeptical and hesitant to get involved in what they likely saw as a minor HOA dispute, quickly changed their tune. The sheer volume and damning nature of the evidence, the clear pattern of criminal conspiracy, was too much to ignore. They agreed to open a full-scale criminal investigation, a decision that would send shockwaves far beyond our small, affluent community. I wasn't just going after a civil judgment anymore. I was now engaged in a full-scale legal war for my family, my home, and the very principle of due process. Brenda had picked a fight with the wrong quiet guy on the hill. The weeks that followed were a surreal kind of quiet. The media vans eventually packed up, the initial shock and fury giving way to a low, simmering tension. The sight of our former home, once so full of life and light, was now a desolate, fenced-off wasteland, a scar on the landscape. My family and I were living in a temporary residence, a place that felt more like a waiting room than a home. It was a strange limbo, but a necessary one. Throughout it all, I maintained a level of public and private calm that unnerved everyone, especially Brenda. She had expected a public meltdown from the governor, a tearful and angry display that she could use to paint herself as a victim. But that's not how I operate. As an engineer and a man of facts, I knew that emotional outbursts were a waste of energy. Every ounce of my resolve was being channeled into the methodical, patient dismantling of her life's work. She didn't understand the silence. It was my greatest weapon. Brenda, meanwhile, was operating from a place of supreme overconfidence. She continued to give arrogant statements to the press, a stream of self-serving nonsense where she portrayed herself as a principled small-town volunteer being unfairly targeted by a powerful politician. "Some people think they're above the rules," she'd say, her voice dripping with self-righteous indignation. It was a masterclass in projection. Her arrogance hit a new peak when a beige envelope arrived at our temporary residence. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter, demanding that I stop harassing the HOA and its board members. It was so brazen, so utterly tone-deaf, that a genuine smile spread across my face. Brenda was overplaying her hand, emboldened by her own delusion of power. She didn't see the thousands of hours my team had spent, the mountain of evidence, the legal net tightening around her. She saw a politician who hadn't broken. She mistook my calm for weakness, my silence for inaction. And that, I knew with a chilling certainty, was her greatest weakness. The storm wasn't just coming. It was already here, and she had no idea how to prepare for it. While Brenda was busy reveling in her imagined victory, a different kind of preparation was underway. For weeks, my team had worked hand in hand with the State Attorney General's office, a group of dedicated professionals who had meticulously pieced together the puzzle we had laid out for them. The financial records, the digital footprints, the tearful testimonies of the other victims, it was all culminating in a single, devastating moment. The day arrived with a sense of quiet inevitability. A press conference was called, but I was not there. It was crucial that this not be seen as a personal vendetta or a political power play. I needed the full, impartial weight of the law to fall upon them. So I stayed away, watching the press conference on a small television in my temporary office. The Attorney General, a serious and unsmiling woman, stood at a podium and calmly, methodically laid out the facts. She didn't mince words. She detailed the fabricated invoices, the blatant fraud, the existence of the shell corporation used to funnel money from the HOA's coffers, and the illegal demolition of a private home. The phrases she used were clinical and chilling. A pattern of intimidation, conspiracy to commit fraud, felony destruction of property. She outlined the multiple severe charges against Brenda and several key members of the HOA. Board. The final words were the most satisfying. Warrants have been issued for their immediate arrest. A collective gasp went through the room. The news was an explosion, sending shockwaves through the community and across the state. The media, which had been so quick to report on the HOA dispute, was now scrambling to cover the story of a criminal conspiracy. The hammer had fallen. Brenda's house of cards, built on a foundation of arrogance and deceit, was about to come crashing down in a far more spectacular fashion than mine ever had. There are moments in life that feel like they've been pulled from a movie, and Brenda's arrest was one of them. While I watched the Attorney General's press conference from a quiet room, the drama was unfolding in real time just a few miles away. A convoy of black sedans, looking less like police vehicles and more like something out of a spy thriller, descended upon Brenda's pristine, perfectly manicured home. The flashing blue lights painted violent, dramatic stripes across her immaculate lawn, a stark and fitting contrast to the tranquil facade she had so carefully maintained. The cameras were there, of course, capturing every second. Brenda, caught completely off guard, was led from her house in handcuffs, Her face was not one of resignation or remorse. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief and rage. The smug satisfaction she'd worn on the day she had my home demolished was gone, replaced by the panicked realization that her power was an illusion. "This is a political hit," she screamed at the cameras, her voice cracking with fury. "This is retaliation. I'm being targeted." But her words, so full of self-pity and entitlement, fell on deaf ears. There was a potent, poetic irony in the scene. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood over rose bushes and paint colors was now being arrested for breaking fundamental laws she had so arrogantly declared herself above. The law she had flaunted was now reaching out to seize her. But Brenda wasn't the only one. My team had provided the AG's office with a list of her co-conspirators. We watched as other black sedans peeled off, making their way to the homes of the key HOA board members who had enabled her. We saw their smug, condescending smiles replaced by looks of sheer, unadulterated fear as they, too, were led away in handcuffs. The quiet guy on the hill had finally spoken, and the sound had been deafening. The court proceedings that followed Brenda's arrest were an absolute media circus. The public was hungry for every detail of the HOA from Hell story, and Brenda's attorney was more than happy to give them a performance. He attempted to paint her as a scapegoat, a small-town volunteer simply overwhelmed by the pressures of community governance. He spoke of her as a dedicated, selfless woman who was just trying to do her best, a victim caught in the gears of a political machine. The deflection was audacious. Their entire legal strategy was to turn the spotlight on me, portraying me not as the victim of a crime, but as an abusive, vindictive politician, using my power to crush a perceived slight. It was a lie so big it was almost believable to those who didn't know the facts. Brenda, for her part, played the part of the distraught victim perfectly. In carefully choreographed statements to the press, she would appear with red eyes, her voice quivering with what she hoped was emotion. "I was just trying to enforce the rules," she would say, her eyes darting to the cameras. "I was mistreated by the governor from the very beginning. He thought he was above our community." It was a bold, emotional narrative designed to appeal to a public already suspicious of authority. But what she didn't realize was that a dramatic performance can't stand up to a mountain of evidence. While they were busy with their theatrics, my team was calmly, methodically, and patiently working behind the scenes. We had a stack of fabricated invoices, a detailed map of her financial fraud, and a list of brave witnesses who would testify to her reign of terror. Every tearful statement, every outrageous claim, was met with another piece of irrefutable proof from us. Her narrative was a house of cards, beautiful on the outside, but with no foundation, and my team and I had all the wind we needed to blow it down. For weeks, I had remained silent, a quiet force in the background as the legal system did its work. Brenda and her attorney had filled the airwaves with dramatic, tear-filled narratives of victimhood, but a politician learns when to speak and when to let the facts speak for themselves. The time for the facts had arrived. I called a press conference, not to gloat or to vent my fury, but to make a statement. I stood at the podium, a backdrop of the state seal behind me, and began to speak. My voice was calm and measured, not a flicker of the anger I had felt a month before. I did not talk about personal revenge. Instead, I spoke about the integrity of the law, about the fundamental importance of due process, and about the sacred protection of private property rights. I looked directly into the camera and said that no one, no individual, no organization, not even a powerful HOA is above the law. My home was not just a house, it was a symbol, a case study in what happens when power goes unchecked. It was a story not just about me, but about every homeowner who has ever been intimidated or bullied by a system they were powerless to fight. I used the moment to announce a new initiative to propose statewide regulations to curb HOA overreach, to create an ombudsman's office for homeowners, and to ensure that no one else would ever have to go through what my family did. My authoritative tone, grounded in reason and a clear-eyed vision for reform, stood in stark contrast to Brenda's emotional outbursts. The public, who had been captivated by her soap opera, now saw the clear difference between a performance and a principle. The outrage she had manufactured for herself was nothing compared to the quiet, righteous anger of an entire state watching a governor fight for justice, not just for himself, but for every single one of them. Brenda's arrest was a powerful shockwave that sent ripples of both fear and immense relief through the entire community. It was as if a spell had been broken, the quiet terror that had governed their lives for years finally shattering. In the immediate aftermath, many of the residents, who had been too afraid to speak before, finally felt safe enough to talk. The dam broke, and a flood of new stories came pouring out. Tales of petty tyranny and abuse, of arbitrary fines for things as ridiculous as a child's toy left in the yard for too long, or a single Christmas light that wasn't to Brenda's liking. We heard about financial abuses that went beyond my initial discovery, smaller shell companies, and inflated contracts for services that were never rendered. It became clear that the HOA was less a governing body and more a personal racket, with Brenda at its head and her complicit board members acting as her enforcers. The community was angry, and their anger was now channeled into action. A powerful grassroots movement began, led by a few of the more vocal residents who had secretly been documenting the abuses for years. They called for a complete reform of the HOA's bylaws, demanding transparency, accountability, and term limits. At a special election, a new board was voted in, comprised of sane, reasonable people who promised to govern with integrity. The community began to heal, a slow and painful process of rebuilding trust and repairing the damage that had been done. But the scars of Brenda's reign ran deep. The fear she had instilled, the way she had turned neighbor against neighbor, would take a long time to fade. Yet, seeing my neighbors, once so intimidated, now standing up for their rights and rebuilding their community, was a profound and deeply satisfying moment. The Beige Kingdom was officially over. While the community began its long process of healing, the wheels of justice began to turn with a slow, methodical grind. The criminal trial of Brenda and her accomplices entered the discovery phase, a long and meticulous legal dance that most people never see. This wasn't about drama or flashy headlines. It was about the cold, hard reality of paperwork. My legal team, working in tandem with the State Attorney General's office, was relentless. Every single fabricated document, every forged signature, every suspicious financial transaction was brought to light. We had a team of forensic accountants who painstakingly presented the evidence, charting the flow of money from the HOA's bank accounts to the Shell Corporation and, finally, into the pockets of Brenda's family. It was a digital map of her entire criminal enterprise, a systematic showcase of a deep-seated scheme. The evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of proof built on months of patient, quiet work. Brenda's defense team, confronted with this undeniable truth, had no choice but to resort to desperate, theatrical tactics. They tried to poke holes where there were none, to discredit our witnesses, to cast doubt on the most basic of facts, but their attacks were nothing more than noise. The truth was a fortress, and their flimsy arguments were like pebbles thrown against a stone wall. The legal process, as slow and deliberate as it was, became a testament to patience and persistence. Every single piece of evidence, every witness statement, every single page of the ledger proved that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, premeditated, and deeply personal act of destruction. The wait was long, but every day we got closer to the only outcome that mattered. The truth, in the end, would be their undoing. While the criminal case was a methodical march toward justice, the civil case ran parallel to it, a war of numbers and valuations. My team of financial experts, the same ones who had helped expose the Shell Corporation scam, now turned their meticulous focus to the true cost of Brenda's malice. The goal wasn't just to replace a physical structure, but to exact a full, comprehensive reckoning for every single wrong committed. They calculated not only the cost of the demolition and reconstruction, a staggering sum in and of itself, but also the loss of sentimental value, the cost of temporary housing, and a significant amount for the emotional distress my family had endured. It was a digital ghost, a financial echo of the very real trauma we had experienced. But it wasn't just about me. With the community's support and a clear conscience, we demanded full restitution for every other resident who had been a victim of Brenda's financial schemes. Every single arbitrary fine, every inflated fee, every dollar that had been funneled to her family was accounted for and demanded back. The HOA's assets, what little remained, were immediately frozen by court order, pending the outcome of the cases. This action revealed the true, shocking extent of Brenda's financial mismanagement. What we had initially thought was a lucrative side hustle turned out to be a desperate, last-ditch attempt to keep a near-bankrupt organization afloat. The HOA was a hollow shell. Its coffers bled dry by a woman who saw it as her personal piggy bank. The irony was not lost on me. In her quest for petty power and financial gain, she had not only destroyed my home but had also cannibalized the very organization she claimed to lead. There would be no money left to pay a civil judgment, which was fine by me. The real satisfaction would come from seeing her assets and the assets of her accomplices seized. This wasn't just about getting a check. It was about ensuring that every single person involved paid for their crimes, financially and criminally. The financial reckoning was a cold, hard, and deeply satisfying form of revenge. The day of the criminal trial finally arrived, a moment of reckoning that had been months in the making. The courtroom, a grand room of dark wood and cool marble, was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and, of course, a jury of our peers. Brenda and her accomplices sat at the defense table, their faces pale and drawn, the arrogance they once wore like a second skin now replaced with a palpable fear. I was called as the first witness for the prosecution. I walked to the stand and took my seat, the entire room's focus on me. The prosecutor began the questioning, and I recounted the harrowing morning of the demolition. My voice was calm and factual, not a hint of drama or anger. I spoke as an engineer and as a public servant, not a victim. I described the sounds and the feeling of the house shaking. I described the desperate rush to get my family to safety. I detailed my confrontation with Brenda and her smug, condescending response. I told the jury about the beige envelope and the absurd list of fines, the audacity of it all. I then described the methodical, patient process of uncovering her deception, the way we followed the financial trails and the digital footprints. My testimony was powerful precisely because of its understatement. It wasn't a performance. It was a factual report from a man who had been wronged but had not been broken. I was followed by other residents, brave souls who recounted their own stories of being terrorized by Brenda's reign. The elderly couple with their binder of receipts, the families who had been forced to move, and the single mothers who had been threatened with foreclosure. Each testimony, each quiet, tearful account, added another layer to the weight of evidence against Brenda. It was an overwhelming tidal wave of truth, crashing down on a defense team that had no choice but to watch it happen. The emotional antagonist was now facing a calm, methodical wave of righteous justice that she could not control, and the jury was watching every second of it. Just when Brenda's legal team thought they had managed to sow a little bit of doubt, a former administrative assistant for the HOA walked into the state attorney general's office. She was a quiet, unassuming woman, but she carried in her hands what would become the final nail in Brenda's coffin, a small, meticulously kept personal ledger. She had been a silent witness to Brenda's reign of terror for years, and a deep-seated guilt had finally compelled her to come forward. The ledger was a chronological and damning account of Brenda's instructions, a physical record of every crooked move. It detailed her commands to shred legitimate homeowner correspondence, the careful fabrication of invoices, and the diversion of funds to the shell corporation with Brenda's brother-in-law. The ledger was a treasure trove of malice, but one entry in particular sealed Brenda's fate. Just a few weeks before the demolition, there was a specific, chilling note. Deal with the governor's recalcitrant attitude regarding paint and historical laws. It was a clear, unambiguous confirmation of a personal vendetta. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the demolition was not a mistake, not an overzealous act of a volunteer, but a premeditated, targeted act of destruction. The smoking gun had been found. The revelation sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Brenda's defense, which had been so focused on painting her as a misunderstood victim, was completely shattered. There was no way to spin this. The quiet, calm, factual evidence from a guilt-ridden witness was far more powerful than any tearful testimony from the defendant. As the prosecutor held up the ledger, Brenda's face, for the first time, lost all semblance of composure. The mask of defiance crumbled, replaced by the raw, naked fear of a person who had just realized that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. She had been undone, not by my power, but by her own arrogance, and the very paper trail she thought she had meticulously erased. The air in the courtroom was thick with a tension so palpable you could almost feel it humming. The jury had been deliberating for 3 long days, and now they were returning. We all rose as they filed back into the room, their faces unreadable masks. Brenda sat beside her lawyer, her face a pale, strained imitation of the smug confidence she had worn for so long. The foreman handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, who in turn passed it to the judge. The judge's eyes scanned the paper, and a slow, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction passed over her face. "Members of the jury," she began, her voice ringing out in the silent room, "have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a man with a kind face who had listened intently to every piece of testimony, said simply, "We have, Your Honor." And then the moment came. The judge asked for the verdicts, and the foreman, his voice steady and clear, read each one. "On the count of criminal fraud, we, the jury, find the defendant, Brenda Thompson, guilty." A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by a wave of relieved murmurs. "On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant, guilty." Another wave of relief. The prosecutor next to me let out a quiet, satisfied sigh. "On the count of felony destruction of property, we find the defendant, guilty." A final, triumphant feeling washed over me. I looked at Brenda. Her face, which had been so perfectly composed throughout the trial, was now pale and contorted, a mask of disbelief and raw fury. The very person who had sought to destroy my home had been undone by her own crimes. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them, and as the room began to stir with the quiet chatter of people processing what had just happened, I felt a deep, profound sense of vindication. Justice, slow and methodical, has finally prevailed. The woman who had believed she was above the law had just learned a very hard lesson about what happens when you cross a line you can't come back from. The verdict was just the beginning. The sentencing was the final devastating chapter of Brenda's downfall. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had presided over the trial with a quiet, steely authority, didn't mince words. She spoke of the profound breach of trust, the abuse of power, and the psychological and financial toll their actions had taken on an entire community. The sentences were substantial. Brenda and her co-conspirators were given years in state prison, a stark and public reminder that the power they had so gleefully abused came with a deep and serious responsibility. The look on Brenda's face as the sentences were read was a mixture of shock and dawning horror, the full weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. The judge also ordered full restitution to me and every single victim of her fraud. She knew the HOA's coffers were empty, so she ordered that the judgment would be against Brenda and her accomplices personally, ensuring that every dollar they had, every asset they owned, would be seized to compensate for the damages. This wasn't about a simple fine. It was about ensuring they lost everything, a true financial reckoning for their crimes. The civil case concluded with a massive judgment against them, a number so large it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. I held another press conference, but this time it was different. There was no anger, no vindication, just a quiet, sober reflection. I reiterated the importance of accountability and the profound resilience of justice. I spoke not just as a victim, but as a governor, ensuring that what happened to my family would never happen again. Brenda's reign of terror was over, her power was gone, and her life was now a cautionary tale of what happens when entitlement and arrogance cross paths with the unwavering, methodical march of the law. The legal battles were over, but the work was far from done. Months after the sentencing, the first bulldozers arrived on the site of our demolished home, not to destroy, but to rebuild. As a former structural engineer, I couldn't just stand by. I became an active participant in the reconstruction, overseeing every detail, from the reinforced foundation to the restored facade. My hands were on the blueprints again, ensuring the new home wasn't just a replica, but something stronger, more resilient, and more beautiful than what had been so cruelly taken from us. This physical reconstruction was more than just a building project. It was a physical metaphor for the healing process my family and our community were undergoing. The dust of the demolition was replaced with the sounds of hammers and saws, each strike a symbol of our collective resilience. But the rebuilding wasn't just about my home. I took the same methodical, patient approach and applied it to the community. I worked closely with the new HOA leadership, a group of dedicated, honest neighbors who were as disgusted as I was by Brenda's tyranny. We established new bylaws that were clear, transparent, and fair. We implemented term limits and created an independent ethics committee to ensure that such an abuse of power could never happen again. My office also worked with the state legislature to pass new regulations curbing the power of HOAs, a series of laws that would forever be known as Caldwell's Law. It was a promise made and a promise kept. The quiet guy on the hill had turned a personal tragedy into a legacy of justice and reform. The physical scars on my property would heal, and with it, the community, which had been so fractured by fear, would rebuild itself into something stronger, more honest, and more united than ever before. Months into the reconstruction, a sense of quiet triumph began to replace the initial white-hot anger. The rage I had felt on that cold morning was long gone, replaced by a deep, profound sense of vindication. I often found myself walking the site of our new home, my hand resting on a cold iron beam that would soon be part of the main structure. It was a tangible link to the journey from destruction to restoration. As I watched the house take shape, brick by brick, beam by beam, I realized that the true victory was never just about seeing Brenda brought to justice. It was about something far more fundamental. It was about protecting the principles of homeownership, the simple, unalienable right to feel safe and secure in your own house without fear of a tyrannical bureaucrat. It was about upholding the rule of law and proving that even a small, seemingly insignificant act of petty tyranny could not stand against the weight of a righteous cause. My family, though scarred by the ordeal, was stronger for it. We had navigated the crisis together, our bond forged in the crucible of a shared trauma. We had learned to trust our instincts, to stand up for ourselves, and to never let a bully, no matter how powerful, dictate our lives. My children, once so terrified, now watched the construction with a fascination that bordered on excitement. They saw not a demolished home, but a new beginning, a symbol of our resilience. The beige envelope, which had started this entire nightmare, was now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of hope and a profound, quiet gratitude for the things that truly mattered. The quiet guy on the hill had won, and the victory was even more satisfying than I had ever imagined it could be. As the new house rose from the ashes of the old one, a profound and simple truth became clear to me. This entire ordeal, this bizarre and devastating chapter of my life, was more than just a personal story of triumph. It was a lesson for everyone. The first lesson was about the subtle forms of tyranny. We often look for evil in grand, sweeping gestures, in wars and dictatorships, but true malice often hides in the mundane details of our daily lives. It can be found in a beige envelope, in the petty rules of a homeowners association, or in the arbitrary decisions of someone who believes they are above reproach. Brenda wasn't a monster from a movie. She was a bully with a clipboard, and she was far more dangerous for it. The second lesson was the importance of fighting for what's right. Even when it seems like an unwinnable battle, it would have been easier to walk away, to simply rebuild somewhere else and let her have her little kingdom. But I knew that if I did, it would happen to someone else, and the cycle of fear and intimidation would continue. A righteous cause fueled by anger and a sense of justice can be a powerful engine for change. The final, and most crucial, lesson was about the power of professional expertise when combined with moral indignation. My knowledge as an engineer, my team's skills in forensic accounting and law, were not just tools for my career. They were the weapons I used to dismantle a corrupt system. Brenda thought she was fighting a politician, a public figure who could be swayed by public opinion. She didn't realize she was up against a methodical, patient, and highly skilled professional who saw her entire operation as a problem to be solved. The quiet guy up the hill, the one she had so arrogantly dismissed, had taught the entitled bullies a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. And that, I realized, was a victory far more satisfying than any court judgment could ever be. A little over a year after that cold, terrifying morning, the work was finally done. We stood at the bottom of the long, winding driveway, looking up at the house on the hill. It wasn't just a building, it was a testament. The new mansion stood majestic and unyielding, its grand facade a perfect replica of the historic original, but its foundation was stronger, its walls more solid. It was a symbol of resilience, a monument to the triumph of justice. It was a physical manifestation of the long, slow, and satisfying process of vindication. The house was not the only thing that had been rebuilt. The community itself, once fractured by fear and petty tyranny, had also found a new dawn. Under its new ethical leadership, the neighborhood was no longer a place of quiet dread but of renewed camaraderie. It was a place where neighbors talked, where children played freely, and where people helped each other. The scars of Brenda's reign were still there, but they were now healing into a powerful shared history. As my family and I walked up the drive, the keys in my hand felt heavy and significant. We were not just moving into a new house, we were beginning a new chapter. We stepped over the threshold and into the sun-filled foyer, the silence of the empty rooms, a peaceful contrast to the chaos we had left behind. The final perfect piece of this story was a small, almost insignificant detail. In my new study, a room I had meticulously designed, with a sense of quiet authority, I had a single item framed and mounted on the wall. It was the beige envelope. Not a replica, but the actual envelope that had contained the absurd fines in the demolition order. It was a permanent reminder of the day my life had changed, of the audacity of a bully, and of the righteous rage that had fueled my fight. It was a reminder of how I had turned a nightmare into a victory, a testament to the power of a principle, and a symbol of how the quiet guy up the hill always gets the last word.